The massive ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a Tuesday morning, casting a shadow over the entire city of Denver. People stopped in the streets. Cars pulled over. Children pointed at the sky. For decades, humans had wondered if they were alone in the universe. Now they had their answer. The ship was enormous, easily 5 miles wide, shaped like a curved disc with strange markings along its surface. It moved slowly, almost carefully, as if whoever controlled it wanted to avoid causing damage. The world watched through television screens and phone cameras as the vessel settled in a large, empty field outside the city. Within hours, military forces surrounded the landing site. Helicopters circled overhead. News crews set up cameras at a safe distance. The President of the United States addressed the nation, urging calm. Similar scenes played out across the world as leaders tried to prepare their people for whatever came next. For 3 days, nothing happened. The ship just sat there, silent and still. Scientists took readings. Diplomats argued about who should make first contact. Religious leaders offered prayers. Regular people went about their lives, glancing nervously at the sky. Then on the 4th day, a door opened. The first aliens to step onto Earth were not what anyone expected. They were tall, standing about 7 feet high, with gray-blue skin and 4 arms. Their faces had large, dark eyes and small mouths. They wore simple silver clothing that looked almost like uniforms. Behind them came more of their kind, perhaps 20 in total. The world held its breath. But it was what came next that truly surprised everyone. Walking beside the tall aliens, connected to them by thin metal chains, were creatures that looked remarkably like dogs. They were about the size of large German shepherds, covered in short brown fur, with 4 legs and tails that hung low between their back legs. Their eyes were different from Earth dogs, more golden and wider, but the resemblance was unmistakable. These creatures walked with their heads down. Their movements were slow and careful. Some of them had scars on their bodies, visible even from a distance. They did not wag their tails or show any sign of happiness. They simply followed the tall aliens, obedient and silent. The first meeting between humans and the Valdori, as the aliens called themselves, did not go well. The Valdori leader, whose name was translated as High Commander Zethrak, seemed confused by human customs. When the human delegation approached with hands extended for handshakes, Zethrak stepped back with what appeared to be disgust. When humans spoke, the Valdori seemed to grow impatient, their large eyes narrowing with what humans later learned was contempt. But the real problem came from the dog-like creatures. The Valdori called them the Korath. They were, according to Zethrak, a servant species that the Valdori had kept for thousands of years. The Korath existed only to serve. They carried supplies, cleaned living spaces, performed manual labor, and entertained their masters. They were not pets in the human sense. They were property, tools with fur and legs. Dr. Sarah Chen was part of the scientific delegation allowed near the landing site. She was a biologist who had spent her career studying animal behavior, particularly in dogs and wolves. When she first saw the Korath, her heart broke. She recognized the signs immediately. The lowered heads, the tucked tails, the flinching movements whenever a Valdori came close. These were signs of fear, not respect. These creatures had been beaten down, physically and emotionally, until nothing remained but submission. During a break in negotiations, Sarah approached one of the Korath. The creature was tied to a post near the alien ship, sitting alone in the grass. Its handler, a Valdori soldier, had walked away to speak with others. Sarah moved slowly, just as she would with a frightened Earth dog. She crouched down, making herself smaller, less threatening. She did not look directly at the creature's eyes, knowing that direct eye contact could be seen as a challenge. "Hey there," she said softly. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." The Korath looked at her with those strange golden eyes. Its body trembled slightly, but it did not run. After a moment, its nose twitched, sniffing the air between them. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a granola bar. She always carried snacks during long field assignments. She broke off a small piece and held it out, palm flat, just as she would offer a treat to any dog. The Korath stared at the food. Its eyes widened. Very slowly, as if expecting punishment at any moment, it leaned forward and took the piece from her hand. It chewed quickly, nervously, then looked at her with something Sarah could only describe as confusion. "Want more?" Sarah asked, breaking off another piece. This time the Korath took it faster. Its tail moved slightly, just a small twitch, but Sarah noticed. After thousands of hours studying animal behavior, she knew what she was seeing. This creature, despite everything it had been through, still had the capacity to trust. The Valdori handler returned and saw what was happening. His reaction was immediate and violent. He shouted something in his language and struck the Korath hard across the face. The creature yelped, a sound that was heartbreakingly similar to a dog's cry of pain, and cowered on the ground. Sarah jumped to her feet. "Stop it, what are you doing?" The handler pointed at her and spoke angrily. His translation device rendered his words in flat, emotionless English. "You do not feed Korath. They eat only what we give them. They are not your concern." "It was just a piece of food," Sarah said, her voice shaking with anger. "There was no reason to hit it. Korath must know their place. They serve, they do not receive gifts. This is the way of things." Other humans had gathered now, drawn by the commotion. They watched as the handler dragged the Korath away, the creature whimpering softly as it was led back toward the ship. That night, the video of what happened spread across the internet. Sarah had not known that someone was recording, but they were. Millions of people watched a human woman show kindness to a strange alien creature, and then watched that creature be punished for accepting it. The reaction was swift and powerful. People who had been nervous about the aliens now felt something stronger. They felt angry. They felt protective. They felt that familiar human instinct that had made them domesticate dogs and cats and horses thousands of years ago, the instinct to care for creatures that could not care for themselves. The comment sections filled with outrage. How could these aliens treat animals this way? Were all the Korath suffering like this? What kind of civilization was built on such cruelty? Meanwhile, the official negotiations continued. The Valdori had come to Earth seeking resources, specifically certain minerals that were abundant on Earth but rare elsewhere in their sector of space. They offered advanced technology in exchange, things that could solve many of Earth's problems. But the mood had changed. When General Marcus Webb led the next meeting with High Commander Zethrak, he found himself looking at the alien with new eyes. He saw the way the Valdori ignored the Korath that stood silently nearby. He saw the marks on the creature's body, old scars and fresh bruises. "We need to discuss something beyond trade," General Webb said. Zethrak tilted his head, a gesture that meant curiosity. "What more is there to discuss? We offer technology, you provide minerals. This is a simple exchange. The creatures you call Korath, we have questions about them." Zethrak's eyes narrowed again. "They are not part of our trade agreement. They are Valdori property. They have always been Valdori property. This is not a matter for discussion." "Maybe it should be," General Webb said quietly. The tension in the room grew thick. The other humans exchanged glances. They all knew what was at stake. The Valdori technology could save millions of lives, cure diseases, create clean energy. But at what cost? And in the corner of the room, standing perfectly still, a Korath watched the humans with eyes that held a small, fragile spark of something it had not felt in a very long time. Hoping. The days that followed the granola bar incident were difficult for everyone. The Valdori could not understand why the humans kept asking about the Korath. To them, it was like asking about chairs or tables. The Korath were objects, useful objects, but objects nonetheless. Dr. Sarah Chen requested permission to study the Korath from a scientific perspective. The Valdori refused. General Webb pushed for the Korath to be treated more gently while on Earth. The Valdori refused that too. Every attempt at discussion on the topic was met with increasing frustration from both sides. "You humans are strange," Zethrak told General Webb during one meeting. "You concern yourselves with things that do not matter. The Korath have their purpose. They fulfill it. Why would you want to change something that works perfectly?" "Because they're alive," Webb replied. "They feel pain, they feel fear. That matters to us." Zethrak made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Many things are alive. Plants are alive. We do not weep for the plants we eat. You eat animals on your planet, yes. Cows and chickens and fish. Do you weep for them?" It was a fair point, and Webb struggled to answer it. But there was something different about the Korath, something that made humans see them as more than livestock. Maybe it was the way they looked like dogs. Maybe it was the intelligence in their eyes. Maybe it was simply that humans had seen them up close, had watched them suffer, and could not turn away. The negotiations continued, but progress was slow. The Valdori grew impatient. They had expected to land, make a deal, and leave within a week. Instead, they found themselves stuck on a planet full of creatures who wanted to discuss philosophy and morality instead of trade agreements. Sarah, meanwhile, had not given up. She spent her days near the landing site, watching the Korath whenever she could. She noticed things that the Valdori seemed blind to. She saw the way the Korath communicated with each other through small gestures and sounds. She saw how they helped each other when the handlers were not watching, one Korath licking another's wounds, or sharing scraps of food when they thought no one was looking. They were not mindless servants. They were a community, a traumatized community, but a community nonetheless. One afternoon, Sarah managed to speak with a Valdori scientist named Nethril. Unlike the soldiers and commanders, Nethril seemed more open to conversation. He studied alien life forms, which was why he had come to Earth. "The Korath interest you," Nethril observed. "I have watched you watching them." "They're fascinating," Sarah admitted. "How long have the Valdori kept them?" "Our records say 6,000 years, though some believe longer. They were wild once, on a planet we conquered long ago. We found them useful and kept them." "Were they intelligent when you found them?" Nethril's large eyes blinked slowly. "They had basic social structures, simple language, primitive tools, nothing impressive. We improved them through selective breeding, made them better servants." Sarah felt sick, but she kept her voice calm. "Have you ever considered that they might be more than servants, that they might have their own wants and needs? What they want does not matter. What matters is what they can do for us." Nethril paused, studying her face. "You are upset. I do not understand why." "Because on Earth, we believe that all thinking creatures deserve respect. We believe that causing unnecessary suffering is wrong." "Suffering builds character," Nethril said simply. "It teaches obedience. A Korath that has suffered is a Korath that knows its place. This is wisdom, not cruelty." Sarah wanted to argue, but she realized it would be pointless. Nethril was not cruel by his own standards. He simply saw the universe differently. To him, the Korath were tools, and a tool did not need happiness. It just needed to work. That night, Sarah wrote a detailed report about her observations. She sent it to her superiors and to anyone else she thought might listen. The report described the Korath's behavior, their apparent intelligence, their obvious suffering. She included comparisons to Earth dogs and to other intelligent animals like elephants and dolphins. Her conclusion was simple: the Korath were not objects. They were people, or something very close to people, and they were being tortured. The report spread faster than even Sarah expected. Within days, it had been translated into dozens of languages. Animal rights groups demanded action. Veterinarians offered their services. Ordinary people held signs outside the landing site, calling for the Korath to be freed. The Valdori were confused and then annoyed. Zethrak demanded that the human government stop the protests. General Webb explained that this was not possible, that humans had freedom of expression, that people could believe what they wanted. "Your system is broken," Zethrak declared. "Your people do not know their place. They should obey their leaders, not question them." "We tried that a few times," Webb said dryly. "It didn't work out well." The tension reached its peak on the 12th day after the landing. A young protester somehow got past the security perimeter. He ran toward the Valdori ship, shouting about Korath rights. A Valdori soldier, startled by the intrusion, raised his weapon. The world watched in horror as the soldier fired. The protester fell, clutching his shoulder. Blood spread across his shirt. For a moment everything was still, then chaos erupted. Military personnel rushed to help the wounded man. Other soldiers pointed their weapons at the Valdori. The aliens responded by forming a defensive circle, their own weapons raised. The Korath, caught in the middle, pressed themselves to the ground, whimpering in fear. General Webb pushed his way between the two groups, his hands raised. "Stand down, everyone stand down." "Your human attacked us," a Valdori soldier shouted. "We defended ourselves." "He was unarmed. He was just a kid with a sign." "He entered our territory without permission. On our worlds this means death." The standoff lasted for nearly an hour. Neither side wanted to fire first, but neither side was willing to back down. The wounded protester was eventually carried away, his condition serious but not life-threatening. The Valdori refused to apologize. In the aftermath, negotiations broke down completely. Zethrak announced that the Valdori were done talking. They would leave Earth and never return. The humans had insulted them, questioned their customs, and attacked their soldiers. There could be no trade between their peoples. "Wait," General Webb said. "We can still work this out. There has to be a way." "There is no way," Zethrak replied coldly. "You have shown us what you are. Weak, emotional, obsessed with creatures that do not deserve your attention. We want nothing more to do with you." The Valdori began preparing their ship for departure. The world watched with mixed emotions. Some were relieved that the aliens were leaving. Others mourned the lost opportunity for advancement. And many wondered if this was truly the end, or just the beginning of something worse. But Sarah Chen was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about the Korath. She was thinking about those golden eyes, that tiny movement of a tail, that moment of trust between two species who had never met before. She was thinking that she could not let them leave, not like this. That night, she did something that would change everything. She walked past the security perimeter, using her credentials to get closer than any civilian could. She found a spot near the ship where several Korath were chained, waiting to be loaded for the journey home. She sat down in the grass just as she had before. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply waited. One of the Korath noticed her. It was the same one she had fed, she was sure of it. The creature stared at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, it moved as close as its chains would allow. Sarah reached out her hand. The Korath leaned forward and pressed its nose against her palm. And for just a moment, in the darkness of an alien night on a planet full of conflict, two species connected in the oldest way possible. Through simple kindness. The Valdori ship did not leave that night. A malfunction in one of their systems required repairs, delaying their departure by several days. Some humans whispered that this was fate, that the universe itself wanted them to have more time. Others said it was just bad luck for everyone involved. Sarah Chen was arrested for entering the restricted zone without authorization. She spent 12 hours in a holding cell before General Webb himself came to release her. He sat down across from her, looking tired. "Do you know how much trouble you've caused?" he asked. "I know," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Are you? Because from what I heard, you sat out there for 3 hours, petting that alien creature like it was a stray cat. It came to me. I couldn't just ignore it. Webb sighed and rubbed his face. The Valdori are furious. They say you were trying to steal their property. They're demanding you be punished. What are you going to do? Nothing. You're an American citizen on American soil. They can demand all they want. But Sarah, you have to understand, every time we do something like this, we push them further away. We need that technology. It could save millions of lives. Sarah looked at him steadily. And what about the Korath lives? Don't they count? That's not a fair question. It's the only question that matters. Webb stood up and paced the small room. He was a military man trained to think in terms of strategy and outcomes. But he was also a father, a grandfather, a man who had owned dogs his entire life. He understood what Sarah was feeling, even if he couldn't admit it. What do you want me to do? He finally asked. Storm the ship and rescue them. Start a war with an alien civilization we know nothing about. I want you to try, Sarah said. I want you to talk to them again, not about trade or technology, but about what's right. Maybe they'll listen, maybe they won't, but at least we'll know we tried. Webb was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'll see what I can do. But Sarah, if this doesn't work, if they leave and never come back, that's on both of us. I can live with that, Sarah said. I couldn't live with doing nothing. The next meeting with the Valdori was different from all the others. General Webb did not bring diplomats or politicians. Instead, he brought ordinary people. Veterinarians, animal trainers, farmers, children. He brought people who worked with animals every day, who understood the bond between species. Zethrak was confused by this strange delegation. These are not your leaders. Why would we speak with them? Because they know something your people have forgotten, Webb said. They know how to care for other creatures, not as slaves but as partners. I thought you might want to see what that looks like. The demonstration began with dogs. Several handlers brought in earth dogs of various breeds, from small terriers to large retrievers. The dogs were happy, their tails wagging, their eyes bright. They played with their handlers, following commands not out of fear but out of genuine joy. The Korath watched from their place near the ship. At first they seemed confused. Then something changed. Their ears perked up. Their tails lifted slightly. They had never seen creatures like themselves treated this way, and it awakened something deep inside them. These are your servants, Nethril asked, studying the dogs with scientific curiosity. We call them companions, Webb replied. They live with us, work with us, play with us. They're part of our families. But they obey you. They follow your commands. Most of the time, yes, but not because they fear us. They do it because they want to please us, because they love us and we love them. The word love did not translate well. Nethril asked Webb to explain it several times, but the concept seemed beyond his understanding. How could you love something that was not of your species? How could you care about something that could not contribute to your advancement? But while the adults talked, something else was happening. A young girl, maybe 7 years old, had wandered away from the group. She walked toward the Korath, completely unafraid, drawn by their resemblance to her pet dog at home. Hello, she said, smiling at the nearest Korath. You look sad. Why are you sad? The Korath stared at her. Its handler was not watching, distracted by the demonstration. Slowly, cautiously, the creature lowered its head to the girl's level. Don't be sad, the girl said, reaching out to pat its head. Everything's going to be okay. That's what my mom says when I'm sad. The Korath made a sound, a soft whine that seemed to hold 1,000 years of grief. It pressed its head against the girl's hand, closing its eyes. And then something remarkable happened. The other Korath, seeing this, began to move. They strained against their chains, trying to get closer. They made sounds, not the frightened whimpers of before, but something different, hopeful, pleading. The Valdori handlers finally noticed and shouted commands. They raised their discipline rods, ready to restore order. But they stopped when they saw that every human eye was on them. "Go ahead," Webb said quietly. "Hit them. Show us who you really are." The handlers hesitated. They looked at Zethrak, who looked at the crowd of humans, who looked at the chains and the scars and the trembling creatures who wanted nothing more than a moment of kindness. The silence stretched for what felt like forever. Then Zethrak made a gesture, and the handlers lowered their weapons. "You are a strange species," Zethrak said to Webb. "You care about things that do not matter. You waste energy on emotions that serve no purpose. And yet your animals are healthier than ours. They are more obedient, more willing, more capable. I have observed them. They do not flinch when you approach. They do not cower. They seem to want to serve you." "That's because they know we won't hurt them," Webb said. "They trust us." "Trust?" Zethrak tasted the word. "We do not have this concept among the Valdori. Trust suggests equality. We do not believe in equality between species." "Maybe that's something you should reconsider." The conversation continued for hours. It was not a negotiation in the traditional sense. There were no offers or counteroffers. Instead, there were questions. The Valdori asked about human-animal relationships, about history, about science. The humans explained as best they could. By the end of the day, nothing had officially changed. The Valdori still planned to leave. The Korath were still property, but something had shifted in the air, some small crack in the wall between them. That night, Sarah was allowed to visit the Korath again, this time with permission. She brought food and medical supplies. The Valdori watched but did not interfere. One by one, Sarah checked each Korath for injuries. She cleaned wounds, applied bandages, gave treats. She spoke softly to each one, not knowing if they understood her words but hoping they understood her intent. When she reached the Korath she had first befriended, she sat down beside it and simply held it. The creature pressed against her, its body shaking. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry we can't do more." The Korath looked at her with those golden eyes, and though it could not speak, Sarah understood what it was trying to say. "Thank you for trying." The breakthrough came 3 days later, from the most unexpected source. Nithril, the Valdori scientist, had been quietly observing the humans and their animals. He had taken detailed notes, recorded videos, analyzed behaviors, and slowly, reluctantly, he had begun to question everything he had been taught. He requested a private meeting with Sarah. They met in a small tent away from the main negotiations, with only a translator device between them. "I have been thinking," Nithril began, "about what you call love, about trust, about the relationship between your species and your companion animals." And Sarah asked, "Our records say the Korath were primitive when we found them, simple creatures with basic intelligence. We believed we were doing them a favor by giving them purpose." Nithril paused. "But I have been reading the old texts, the truly old texts from before the conquests, and I found something troubling." He held up a device that projected an image into the air. It showed Korath, but not as Sarah had seen them. These Korath stood upright. They wore clothing. They held tools. They looked at the viewer with intelligence and dignity. 6,000 years ago, Nithril said quietly, the Korath had cities. They had art. They had music. They had science. They were not primitive at all. Sarah stared at the image, her heart pounding. What happened? "We happened. The Valdori came to their world seeking resources just as we came to yours. They resisted. We won. And then," Nithril's voice faltered, "and then we decided that it would be easier to control them if they forgot who they had been. We bred them for obedience. We punished intelligence. We destroyed their culture, their history, their sense of self." "You erased them," Sarah whispered. "We made them into what we needed them to be, and we told ourselves it was for their own good." Nithril lowered the projection. "I have been telling myself this my entire life, but watching your people, watching how you treat your animals, I have begun to wonder, what if there was another way? What if we were wrong? Sarah did not know what to say. The weight of what Nethril was describing was almost too much to comprehend. 6,000 years of systematic abuse, of cultural genocide, of turning a proud species into slaves. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally asked. "Because I want to help. I cannot change what my ancestors did, but perhaps I can change what happens next. I have influence among the Valdori scientists. If I can show them evidence, real evidence, that the Korath are capable of more than we believed, they'll listen. Some will, others will not, but it is a start." The plan they developed was simple but risky. Nethril would smuggle several Korath to the humans, who would work with them, document their progress, and prove that they could be more than servants. If successful, this evidence could challenge thousands of years of Valdori belief. It took careful planning. General Webb had to be convinced to go along with it, which required hours of argument. The Valdori leadership could not know, which meant operating in secret. And the Korath themselves had to be willing to participate, which was perhaps the biggest unknown of all. The first Korath they approached was Sarah's friend, the one she had been visiting for weeks. They brought it to a private facility away from the main site, a veterinary center that had been converted into a rehabilitation space. For the first few days, the Korath did nothing. It sat in the corner of its room, waiting for orders that never came. It refused to eat unless given explicit permission. It would not make eye contact with anyone. Sarah spent hours with it every day. She brought toys, treats, puzzles. She talked to it constantly, even knowing it could not understand most of her words. She showed it pictures of Earth animals, videos of dogs playing, images of landscapes and cities, and all the things she loved about her planet. Slowly, so slowly, the Korath began to change. On the 5th day, it ate without being told to. On the 8th day, it played with a ball, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. On the 12th day, it made a sound that Sarah had never heard from a Korath before. It was high-pitched and rhythmic, almost like laughter. And on the 15th day, it spoke. The word was garbled, barely recognizable through vocal cords that had not been used for intelligent speech in generations. But it was unmistakably a word. "Friend." Sarah burst into tears. She had suspected the Korath might still have language capabilities buried deep in their genetics, but to actually hear it, was something else entirely. "Yes," she said, holding the Korath close. "Friend, we're friends." The news spread quickly through the small group involved in the project. More Korath were brought in, and they too began to recover. Some faster than others, some with more difficulty, but all of them showed improvement. They started to play together, to communicate, to explore their environments with curiosity instead of fear. One Korath, larger than the others, turned out to have a talent for problem-solving. It could complete puzzles that Earth dogs struggled with, manipulating objects with surprising dexterity. Another showed artistic ability, using provided materials to create abstract patterns that seemed to have meaning, though humans could not decipher it. But it was Nethril who made the most important discovery. "The suppression is not complete," he announced one evening, his voice filled with excitement. "The genetic modifications we made to reduce their intelligence, they did not destroy the original capabilities. They merely turned them off. With the right environment, the right stimulation, the original traits can be reactivated." "You mean they could go back to what they were?" Webb asked. "Not overnight. It would take generations of proper care, of freedom from punishment, of intellectual stimulation. But yes, eventually, the Korath could become what they once were, a thinking, creating, dreaming species." Sarah looked at the Korath playing in the rehabilitation center, their tails wagging, their eyes bright with newfound joy. "And what about the Valdori?" she asked. "Will they ever allow that?" Nethril's expression grew serious. "That is the question I cannot answer. Change is difficult for my people. We have built our entire civilization on the belief that we are superior, that others exist to serve us. To admit we were wrong, it would require us to examine everything we believe about ourselves. But you're willing to try. I am. Others will be harder to convince, but I believe for the first time in my life that it is possible. The moment of truth came when Zethrak demanded to know why several Korath were missing. The secret could not be kept forever, and on a cold morning 3 weeks after the landing, everything came to a head. Zethrak arrived at the rehabilitation center with soldiers at his back. His face, as much as humans could read Valdori expressions, showed anger. But when he entered and saw the Korath, his anger turned to confusion. They were not cowering. They were not silent. They were playing, eating, making sounds that might have been conversation. They looked at Zethrak not with fear, but with curiosity. One of them, the large problem solver, walked directly up to the High Commander. It looked at him for a long moment, then spoke a single word in the old Korath language, a language that had not been heard on Valdori ships for thousands of years. Why? Zethrak stepped back as if struck. He looked at Nethril, at Sarah, at Webb, at the Korath who stood before him asking a question that had no easy answer. "What have you done?" he whispered. "We showed them kindness," Sarah said. "We treated them with respect, and this is what they became." The silence that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the rehabilitation center were a time of upheaval for both species. Zethrak did not immediately accept what he had seen, but he also did not destroy the evidence. Instead, he ordered more studies, more tests, more observation. He was a commander, trained to make decisions based on facts rather than tradition, and the facts were becoming impossible to ignore. The Korath in the rehabilitation center continued to improve. New ones were brought in as word spread among the Valdori about what was happening. Not all of the aliens approved, of course. Many clung to their old beliefs, insisting that this was a trick, a human manipulation, an attempt to undermine Valdori culture. But others, particularly the younger ones and the scientists, were curious. Nethril became the unofficial leader of what some called the reform movement. He gave presentations, shared data, argued with colleagues who dismissed his findings. It was exhausting work and dangerous too. There were threats against him, attempts to silence him, but he persisted. "I spent my whole life believing a lie," he told Sarah one evening. "I cannot unlearn the truth now that I know it." On Earth, the situation was equally complicated. The original trade agreement was still on hold, tangled in debates about ethics and morality. Some politicians wanted to make the deal regardless, arguing that human lives mattered more than alien animals. Others insisted that humanity could not compromise its values for any technology. Public opinion was divided but passionate. The Korath had become celebrities, their faces appearing on magazine covers and protest signs and children's drawings. People sent letters and gifts to the rehabilitation center. Schools organized fundraisers to support the work. The whole world had fallen in love with these gentle creatures who looked so much like man's best friend. And the Korath themselves, they were changing in ways no one had predicted. The first generation of liberated Korath, as the media called them, showed remarkable progress. Within months, many of them could speak multiple words and understand simple sentences. They could use tools, solve complex problems, express preferences and emotions. They formed friendships not just with humans but with Earth dogs, creating unlikely bonds across species. But it was the second generation that truly surprised everyone. One of the female Korath at the center gave birth to 3 pups just 2 months after her arrival. The bobbies were different from their mother. They grew faster, learned quicker, showed curiosity that bordered on genius. Without the constant trauma and suppression of Valdori captivity, their natural intelligence flourished. By 6 months old, the pups could understand complete sentences in both English and Valdori. By 1 year, they were speaking in short paragraphs. By 18 months, they were reading. Sarah documented everything, creating a massive database of Korath development. The data clearly showed what Nethril had suspected. The genetic potential was still there, buried but not destroyed. Given freedom and care, the Korath could reclaim their heritage. The turning point came at an interspecies conference organized by the United Nations. Representatives from both Earth and the Valdori fleet gathered to discuss the future of human-Valdori relations. Zethrak attended, along with dozens of other Valdori officials. General Webb led the human delegation. But the real stars of the conference were 3 young Korath, now 2 years old and more articulate than anyone had thought possible. They walked onto the stage with heads held high, their tails wagging gently, their eyes bright with intelligence. The eldest, a male named Koru by his human caretakers, stepped to the microphone. He had practiced his speech for weeks, working with Sarah to get every word right. "My ancestors built cities," Koru said, his voice clear and steady. "They wrote poetry, they studied the stars, they dreamed of the future, and then the Valdori came and the dreaming stopped." The audience was silent, captivated. "For 6,000 years my people were told we were nothing. We were beaten until we believed it. We were bred until we forgot who we were, but we never truly forgot. Deep inside, in the part of us that the Valdori could not reach, we remembered." Koru looked directly at Zethrak. The High Commander sat motionless, his large eyes fixed on the young Korath. "The humans showed us kindness. They gave us food without punishment. They touched us without pain. They spoke to us as equals, not as property, and in that kindness we found ourselves again." Koru paused, gathering himself for the most important part. "We do not ask for revenge. We do not ask for apology. We ask only for the chance to be what we were meant to be. We ask for freedom for ourselves and for all Korath who remain in chains. We ask you to see us, truly see us, for the first time in 6,000 years." The silence that followed was profound. Then slowly the human delegates began to applaud. The sound grew, spreading through the hall until it was thunderous. Zethrak stood. The applause died down as everyone waited to hear what he would say. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at Koru, at this young creature who represented everything the Valdori had tried to suppress. Then, in a gesture that shocked his own people, he lowered his head. It was, in Valdori culture, a sign of respect given only to equals. "I have ruled the Valdori fleet for 40 years, Zethrak said slowly. "I have made many decisions, some wise, some foolish, but the decision I make today may be the most important of all." He turned to address the entire assembly. "The Korath are not property. They never were. What we did to them was wrong, and no amount of time can erase that wrong, but perhaps we can begin to make amends." The announcement that followed changed everything. Zethrak declared an end to Korath servitude throughout the Valdori fleet. All Korath would be given the choice: remain with the Valdori as free citizens with full rights, or emigrate to Earth or other worlds that would welcome them. A process of education and rehabilitation would begin immediately, funded by the Valdori government. It was not a perfect solution. Many Valdori protested and some refused to comply. The transition would take years, perhaps decades. Many Korath, after generations of abuse, would struggle to adapt to freedom. There would be setbacks and failures along the way. But it was a beginning. In the months that followed, trade between Earth and the Valdori finally began. The technology the aliens offered started solving human problems: clean energy, medical advances, agricultural improvements. In exchange, humans shared something the Valdori had never known they needed: a new way of seeing the universe, one where kindness was not weakness, where compassion was not foolishness, where every thinking creature deserved dignity. Sarah Chen continued her work with the Korath, helping establish rehabilitation centers on multiple continents. She watched as former slaves learned to laugh, to play, to love. She saw the terror in their eyes slowly replaced by hope, and she knew that whatever else happened, this was what mattered. One evening, years after first contact, Sarah sat in a garden she had built for the Korath. Around her, dozens of them played and talked and lived. Koru, now fully grown, sat beside her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened," he asked, "if you had not fed that first Korath a piece of your food?" Sarah smiled. "Sometimes, I think about all the ways it could have gone differently. The Valdori might have left. We might have made the trade deal without asking about you. The world might have moved on and forgotten. But you did not forget. You saw us when no one else would. Someone had to." Koru leaned against her, much as he had as a frightened pup all those years ago. "Humans are strange," he said. "You care about things that do not benefit you. You fight for creatures who cannot fight for themselves. You risk everything for what you believe is right." Is that strange? To the Valdori, yes. To the old Korath, too. We thought kindness was a weakness, a flaw that stronger species would exploit. He looked up at the stars. We were wrong. Kindness is the strongest thing in the universe. It changes everything. Sarah followed his gaze. Somewhere up there, Valdori ships still traveled between worlds. But now they carried free Korath, citizens rather than slaves, beings with hopes and dreams and futures of their own. It had started with a granola bar, a simple act of kindness, offered without expectation of reward, and it had grown into something that changed two civilizations forever. "Do you think there are others out there?" Koru asked. "Other species kept in chains, waiting for someone to see them?" "Probably," Sarah said. "The universe is very large." "Then we have work to do." Sarah nodded. First contact had gone wrong, spectacularly wrong, in ways that had nearly destroyed any chance of understanding between humans and Valdori. But in the end, it had led to something beautiful. Not because of technology or treaties or grand speeches, but because one person had seen a suffering creature and refused to look away. That was the human way. It had always been the human way. And as long as there were creatures in the universe who needed kindness, it would remain the human way. In the garden, a young Korath pup chased a butterfly, its tail wagging with pure joy. Sarah watched and smiled. This was what first contact was supposed to look like. This was humanity at its best.